Today I wanted to talk about armor. That's why I got out the old chainmail and helmet, and especially armor in RPG. There are generally two ways most RPGs handle armor. Either armor makes you harder to hit, like in D&D, or armor absorbs damage, like in The Dark Eye, for example. There are pros and cons to both approaches. Let's take armor makes you harder to hit. Of course, it doesn't make you harder to hit as such. Armor actually slows you down. It makes it easier to hit you, but it makes it harder to actually hurt you. And I can see where this sentiment is coming from. Like when someone hits me on the helmet, that will probably do not very much, but if he gets lucky or if he ends really well and hits me in the face, the armor will not protect me at all. It has a weak spot right here. But if someone were to hit me on my chainmail, I would still feel the blow. And depending on how hard it is, it could really hurt me. But the chainmail will absorb a lot of the force. It will avert devastating wounds, like when someone clocks me in here with an axe, I might break a rib, but it is unlikely to puncturate the chainmail, actually penetrate into my body and make a huge bleeding wound. So chainmail mainly protects you from cuts, but to a degree also from piercing attacks. Like a really good strong piercing attack can get through a chainmail, but it will lose a lot of its force, so it won't be penetrated as deeply. The other advantage is that it's a fairly fast system. Just hit to attack and then roll damage, subtract from your hit points, done. On the other hand, we've got systems that make armor absorb damage, and that actually makes a lot of sense, at least in my mind. I already explained the chainmail, but even if someone were to hit me on the head on my helmet and not get around it, I would still feel the blow, and depending on how much force there was behind the attack, I might still get a concussion, or maybe even dent my helmet and break my skull underneath it. It was a really heavy attack. So the helmet offers protection, but it's not an absolute protection. With just enough force and violence, you can break through any armor. The cons of a armor absorption system is that you have to do one more calculation, or if the system demands it, do an armor check, an armor roll. I don't like that at all. That's one roll too many in my opinion, but you have to do one more calculation. That's not that big of a deal. So for my own like D&D hack, I just use a very basic absorption system to represent armor. Now, these absorption systems can get fairly involved. You can have, of course, the different amounts of armor, how much armor you're wearing, but also different types of armor. Like in general, chainmail would be better than a gambesson, and plate would be better than chainmail in absorbing damage. But you could also separate what types of damage the armor is good against and give it different absorption values for each type of damage. For example, my gambesson, it's not that much protection, but it absorbs some of the blunt trauma and some of the cutting force from an attack, but it wouldn't do very well against arrows and piercing attacks. They would most likely still punch through, and a really sharp sword can cut fairly well through a gambesson. A blunt one won't. Now chainmail, it's really good at keeping myself from any cutting attacks, any slashing attacks. It does an okay job at protecting me from arrow fire and piercing attacks. This is riveted chainmail. It's fairly resistant to be broken apart, but it's not as good as plate armor. Plate armor can only be penetrated by really strong attacks. Most likely arrows and crossbow bolts will just glance off here. And you would need something like a musket ball to really go reliably through armor. So you already have 3 absorption values for your armor, but you can make the system even more complicated if you want to. How about having different hit zones? And for each hit zone you can have different type of armor and a different armor value. For example, my head would be a hit zone, and I would have plate armor that is protecting like half of it, maybe 2/3 of my head, and then you can calculate the armor value. And on my torso I've got gambizon and chainmail, and you can add these values up. 3 values for the 3 types of damage, and it's protecting pretty much 100% of my torso. And left arm, left leg, right leg, and the back. So I got like 6 armor values per character that each has 3 types of damage it's good against. You think that's complicated? Yes, it is. But the Dark Eye 4th edition actually did it this way. They didn't have different damage types, but they had a complete armor zone system where you could calculate the zone armor and your overall armor value. I personally don't like these very complicated armor systems, because in my mind trying to simulate real life and simulate combat is a fool's errand. You will never be able to take everything into account. There will always be something you miss. But that's okay too. You can pick and choose and only simulate the things you deem important. I mean, if it comes down to it, you're only interested in how much hit points, how much damage an attack does. You could do a very basic combat system with each side just rolling damage, and whoever does more damage comes out on top, of course. You'd think that that's very unrealistic. What if I hit my opponent before he can hit me? Yeah, sure you can, but hit points in RPG usually do not directly represent your bodily harm, how many wounds you got on your body. I wouldn't disregard a pure damage rolling system as unrealistic right off the bat. Well, it's fairly abstract, sure, I give you that. What you also need to take into account is that armor not only protects you, but it's also a hindrance to you. It is, for starters, heavy, and chainmail plate armor can be very heavy, but even relatively light armor, like a good gambizon, will become heavy once it is soaked in sweat. And you will sweat in your gambizon, especially if you are doing physical straining activity, like marching to war, fighting. In summer maybe, your gambizon will be drenched in sweat and it will become very heavy. About 6 to 10 kilograms maybe. Now, to make wearing heavy armor somewhat comfortable, you need to distribute the weight of the armor throughout the body. That's why my chainmail is belted at the waist fairly strongly, and it's like hanging a bit over, so the chainmail does not only pull on my shoulders, but a fair bit of its weight is resting on my waist, making it more comfortable to carry the chainmail and lift my arms up to be able to actually attack. And of course, it's not only the weight. Armor can be fairly bulky. If I, for example, would wear a thicker gambesson underneath this, I would look like the Michelin man, and it would be hard to move. That's why sometimes gambesson was worn over the chainmail. Chainmail is not flexible at all, but the gambesson is. So wearing the gambesson over the chainmail makes it a bit easier to move. But, I basically only wear the minimum of padding. It's a very thin gambesson. It's the minimum of padding I need under my armor, so it's still comfortable. Another advantage of wearing the gambesson over the chainmail would be you can use a smaller and therefore lighter chainmail. This chainmail here actually is fairly big for me, because I used to be a lot bigger myself, and I used to have a thicker gambesson. So this was sized to go over my old gambesson, and now it's actually a bit too wide, a bit too heavy for what it needs to be, but not yet so wide and so heavy that I had enough reason to alter it. It's also not like you sometimes see in old Hollywood movies, where you can't get up in your armor if you're lying on the ground. You're still fairly mobile, you're still very fit. You can find videos on YouTube and guys in full plate armor going through an obstacle course. It's not that hard. You still got a lot of your mobility, but everything is just harder to do. The added weight, the added clumsiness of the armor makes you use a lot more strength than you would if you were not wearing the armor. So everything is just way more exhausting than it is without the armor. So what you mainly need to train to be able to wear armor over long periods is your stamina. So what most role-playing systems do to represent this added clumsiness and slowness of the armor is like giving you a disadvantage on dexterity-based tasks, on sneaking and stuff. And yeah, that's fine to begin with. But many systems don't take into account the added exhaustion of wearing the armor. Because wearing armor actually is kind of a two-edged sword. If the armor becomes so heavy that you can't march in it anymore, it's impractical for warfare or adventuring. Maybe it's just something you can wear for an hour or something during a jousting tourney. Thought about this, I haven't yet tested it out in play or anything, but in a system where like hit points represent your overall endurance and luck, wearing heavy armor could actually reduce your maximum HP, representing the added exhaustion you get from wearing it. It would still be harder to kill, because each time you are hit, the armor will protect you and absorb some or maybe even most of that damage. So it would still be a benefit for you, especially if you receive a lot of light attacks. If you receive like one whooping big attack, if you're overrun by a battering ram, the armor will do you no good. If your gaming system has a robust system for carry and weight, you don't need an extra system for the weight of your armor. It will already be included in your carrying weight system. Like the Forbidden Lands does it that way. Heavy weapons too. So you can only carry so much without being really strong or having special training. So if you pack on heavy weapons and heavy armor, you can't carry that much else or risk getting exhausted very fast. That's also one reason why I find in venturing party a beast of burden, a pack animal, is very useful, not only for carrying back all the loot you find back to town, but also to carry all of your equipment that is not weapons and armor. Maybe even spares in case your weapons and armor break. What you also should consider in an adventure game is how much your armor hinders you, inconvenience you in just everyday activities. For example, you can't really sleep in armor. There's a caveat to that. You can sleep in armor. You can sleep fairly well in a gambizon. You can even sleep fairly well in gambizon and chainmail because it is flexible, it forms to your body. You can't really sleep in plate armor because you just can't get in a comfortable resting position wearing plate armor. So you need to take your heavy armor off to be able to rest, be able to sleep. And that goes for the Paladin in his Holy Avenger plate as well. But there's a caveat to that. You can sleep in gambizon, you can sleep in chainmail, as long as the gambizon is dry. If it is not dry, you will freeze. It will just suck all of the warmth out of your body, and you will be really glad once you can just put it all down and put something dry on, especially if it's cold outside. And as I mentioned before, if you are marching, if you are fighting in gambizon, you will sweat. Putting armor on and off is not that easy either. I mean, parts of the armor, like the helmet, that's not a big problem. I can put this on and off fairly quickly, no problem at all, but this is a very simple helmet. If you go to something like a knight's helmet, something like bassinet, it can be more involved taking it off. It's also not that hard getting this chainmail off. Just have to undo the belt and then do acrobatics for 2 minutes, really leaning over, getting my hands on the ground so that gravity will assist it slipping off my body. My gambizon is closed in the front, so I can just undo it and put it off like a regular coat. That's also not that hard. What is fiddly is getting bracers on and off because you can only use one hand. And in general, it's easier taking the armor off than putting it on. I can put my whole set of armor, gambizon, chainmail, bracers, and greaves off in 5 minutes, and putting it on takes about double that time. So I can put it all on my own in 10 minutes. If you have assistance, it probably halves that time again. Now, some armor is really hard to put on without assistance at all, especially knight's armor, plate armor. That's why a brigandine was still used parallel to full plate armor, because it was just much more convenient to wear all day. You could put it on and off yourself, so it was like the common fighting man's armor. Still fairly expensive piece of equipment. But plate armor sometimes is closed on the side, maybe the back, and undoing all the straps and buckles, doing all the straps and buttons, holding it in place. You really want to have help for that. That's why knights used to have a page help getting the armor on it off and keeping it clean, polishing it to a mirror-like shine. I mean, full plate armor is so expensive that you should be able to afford some stuff helping you maintain it when you have plate armor. In lab, I always make jokes about that. I say, if you can't take off your own armor, you're not fit fighting. A jest towards all those knights that have actually way more expensive and better armor than I could afford, but can't take it off, can't put it on themselves because it is full plate armor. It's the jest of me, lowly mercenary, towards the noble knights. And that is pretty much all about armor I wanted to talk about today. What about you? What experience in wearing armor do you have? And what systems for representing armor in your game do you like to use? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.